Sauropods as a group are known worldwide for two things: their immense size and their long necks. So it's kind of surprising that their necks are still a bit of a mystery? There seems to be a sort of dissonance with how their necks are oriented. You'd be surprised how wide-reaching our lack of understanding is. This became apparent to me when I was working on the second episode of my Walking with Dinosaurs redesign series. The Diplodocus in the episode is the quintessential horizontal sauropod, but when I went to research how accurate that was, the ensuing rabbit hole left me with so much information that to synthesize a quick synopsis would be unsatisfying. So in this video, I'll be using Diplodocus as a main case study, both because it's what got me into this mess, and it seems to be every sauropod paper's go-to when neck posture is brought up. The intuitive way to figure out how sauropods held their necks would be to just re-articulate the bones. But bones can be posed in many ways. So what do? For articulating the cervical vertebrae of sauropods, we have the osteological neutral pose, or ONP. There are these projections on the side of vertebrae called the zygapophyses, and in osteological neutral pose, they are at a maximum overlap. Stevens and Parrish used their new software Dynamorph to restore the skeleton of Diplodocus as well as Apatosaurus. They found that the neutral pose of Diplodocus was a straight horizontal neck with a slight downward orientation. They also used the osteological neutral pose to quantify the flexibility of the neck using ONP50. The idea is that when the overlap of the zygapophyses is at 50%, that's the limit to the range of motion. With that methodology, they found that Diplodocus could barely raise its head over its back. It could look to the side, but not directly behind it, and they had a surprising amount of ventral flexibility, enough to bypass the ground. Apatosaurus basically one-upped Diplodocus in the entire flexibility category, and could look behind itself and raise its head high enough to adopt a near S pose. At this time, sauropod necks seem to have been more or less up to personal interpretation, with different workers reasoning different orientations, but this was the first big paper on their posture. Upchurch in 2000 wrote that the Dynamorph model incorrectly used the base of the neck as a fixed reference point, and didn't account for the rest of the body. He's not wrong either. The neck is in context with the body, and even relatively small changes can have quite an impact. You may be wondering why this wannabe vintage Brontosaurus has this bell-curved spine, while this modern one is more sloped. Tetrapods have two girdles, the pectoral and the pelvic. The pectoral girdle is composed of the scapula and coracoid. In dinosaurs, these bones don't articulate to the axial skeleton, and so determining their orientation is tricky. Most tend to be sub-horizontal with a range of 10 to 60 degrees. Alternatively, near vertical reconstructions were argued for depictions that are, shall we say, odd. Sprawling Diplodocus isn't just a weird example of old paleoart, but a genuine proposal by Hay in 1908. Specifically for Diplodocus, he thought that they were plantigrade and had a gait akin to a modern saurian. In 1910, he did grant that Diplodocus was digitigrade, but used tortoises as a reason for that not meaning they were upright. What's funny is that over 100 years ago, Hay mentions the semicircular shape and thumb spike of Diplodocus, which means that elephant feet even in vintage works is even more wrong. It's interesting to see that even back then, he was in the minority, with Hatcher correctly pointing out that they were upright, and that they couldn't have been aquatic since the stratigraphy didn't line up. Nowadays, we know that sauropods held themselves upright. Some reconstructions allow for a tiny bit of a semi-sprawl, and from trackways, we can even tell that the center of mass affects how wide of a gait they had. Giraffatitan, with a more central center of mass, is thought to have made wider trackways, while Diplodocus was found to be most stable when walking more narrowly. But back to shoulders. Sometimes the scapulae can be found in the rough position they were in life, like in this Camarasaurus, but that angle being correct is dubious at best. That same Camarasaurus had displaced limbs too, so I don't know if we can trust that. So to find more accurate positions of the scapulae in sauropods, Schwartz and co-authors in 2007 looked at a bunch of living reptiles so they could bracket the position. They also did muscle reconstructions and calculations involving the load they would take in life, since derivations on the basic shoulder design in some groups can confound the bracket. For Diplodocus, they got a scapula angled at 60 to 65 degrees. This raises the anterior torso a bit. They also calculated a 70 degrees for Camarasaurus and 55 and 65 degrees for Opisthosilicadia. The more inclined scapulae also provide greater attachment points for muscles. Paul in 2017 noted that if the scapula was horizontal like it is in birds, the sternal plates would be vertically oriented, which is abnormal. Granted, sternal plates also have dubious positions, but most skeletals seem to agree with this. For the pelvic girdle, we looked to Vidal et al. In 2020. They looked at the orientation of the sacrum in Spinosaurus and found that previous reconstructions underestimated how wedged the sacrum is. This is actually a feature in all of Sauropods, and in high browsers whose forelimbs are equal or exceed the length of their legs, like they restore for Spinosaurus, their sacrum can be angled up to 30 degrees. This is why in more modern paleoart you see that bend before the tail. It's the caudal vertebrae curving back after the sacrals. This is an extreme case in Mamenchisaurus youngi, especially when compared to Mamenchisaurus hertwanensis, although hertwanensis is likely its own thing, but I digress. Spinosaurus has the position of the head higher than the shoulders, even in osteological neutral pose. Diplodocoids have a much more acute angle, and this actually has the run-on effect of many neural spines being perpendicular to the ground instead of making that smooth bell curve. Diplodocoids have their anterior dorsals curve back downwards, which is something Gilmore noticed back in 1932. In Dicryosaurus, this is more pronounced, and this creates a really droopy-looking animal.
Have a good day, sir.
For Diplodocus, the downward curve mostly just cancels out the upward one at the pelvis, so that's why there's straighter backs in more modern reconstructions. This is also why many modern reconstructions have that slant as opposed to a curved neck. So as the body of many sauropods now oriented at an angle, a straight neck follows suit. For Diplodocus though, the neutral is still more horizontal because of its downward inclination. Unfortunately, osteological neutral pose isn't set in stone, and it's debated whether it truly represents the actual living pose a relaxed sauropod would take. Taylor, Wedel, and Naish in 2009 looked at a bunch of modern tetrapods and came to the conclusion that amniotes, as a rule, tend to keep an erect posture, as opposed to their osteological neutral one. They reconstruct Diplodocus' neck this way, with an upturn at the base of the neck that the dynamorph model didn't take into account. This results in a quite steep neck, though not as much as some older depictions. They also orient the head at quite a sharp angle relative to the neck, in order to ensure that the semicircular canal of the inner ear is kept parallel to the ground. Furthermore, they say that the dynamorph model's lack of dorsal flexibility isn't accurate, because the physical manipulation of a Diplodocus specimen at the Denver Museum of Natural History showed a greater range of motion, and that soft tissue on top of that would have further increased said range of motion. Now, I've seen a lot of people take the study as the last word on sauropod posture online.
So, the argument is that unless sauropods such as Diplodocus were, for some reason, different from all other groups of land-based amniotes, they too must have generally held their necks in a much more vertical pose than that shown in Walking with Dinosaurs. If a Diplodocus-like animal were to rear up like this, the brain would suddenly become several meters higher than the heart. Blood pressure needed to get blood to the brain would also increase by a significant amount.
What?
But people seem to have missed Stevens' response in 2013. First, he clarifies that osteological neutral pose does not mean horizontal neck in sauropods. It just means a straight neck. The sigmoid curve in a bird's neck is intrinsic to its osteological neutral pose, according to Stevens. And that Diplodocus in the Denver Museum is a cast of a specimen in the Carnegie Museum. And that crook in the neck is a result of the cervicals behind C10 being heavily restored. The actual specimen doesn't have this bend in the neck. Furthermore, the semicircular canal in a horizontal Diplodocus would still be horizontal with the neck at just a shallower angle. He also contradicts Taylor et al. By stating that soft tissue would restrict the range of motion, not increase it, something we'll discuss later on. He also considers extant phylogenetic bracketing as merely grounded speculation, since we can't test the hypotheses, we can't confirm or refute them. But then he goes on to state that extant animals hold their necks in ONP anyways, with the exception of some mammals that rest their heads behind their shoulders. I can sort of understand his reasoning for phylogenetic bracketing being flawed, but this is paleontology. In the absence of direct evidence, it's the best we have. Also, he says that the lizard and the salamander are holding their heads in a horizontal osteological neutral pose in the paper. I looked at the paper, and they aren't. It's kind of a weird misinterpretation to me. To me, it seems like if the necks continued along their natural progression, they'd be raised. Also, I'm fairly certain osteological neutral pose isn't a sauropod neutral, since the way he reconstructs Jurassic Titan, we get this. I realize that rejecting an idea in science because it's not intuitive isn't really the way to go, but clearly the rest of the animal's anatomy is forcing this front half high up. Historically, sauropods have been considered the least specialized dinosaurs, but that's far from true. They're super specialized and the most successful clade of dinosaurs by far, and their feeding mechanism and necks were the key to their success. Sauropods don't masticate their food like ornithischians. They just chopped or stripped foliage and swallowed it immediately, letting the gut do the work. This meant that they could get away with having a smaller head, and with a smaller head, they could grow their necks longer. Not only can long necks help reach higher places, they increase the feeding envelope of the animal. Now, they've got a much larger area they can feed from without moving. It's an incredibly efficient system. Part of Stevens' reasoning for why a horizontal Giraffatitan is still feasible is because of how large the feeding envelope still is. When the idea of a flexible neck, almost like a tentacle or a snake, fell out of favor, workers made connections to a sort of system akin to a drawbridge or lever. The Walking with Dinosaurs novelization does this, for example. However, this isn't quite accurate. Sauropod necks were more like segmented beams, and this allowed for much more finessed motor control, which is necessary to pilot that tiny head towards food. Figuring out just how flexible the neck is tricky. We have that soft tissue contradiction from earlier. The cervical ribs in sauropods are thought to be ossified tendons, and they vary in length by group. Brachiosaurids and Mamenchisaurids, for example, have some of the longest cervical ribs of any sauropod, while Diplodocids have really short ones. This could mean that Diplodocids had more flexible necks. Longer cervical ribs are beneficial in providing more structure and resistance against torsion, which makes sense when you see how long the necks of something like Mamenchisaurus is. Sauropods, like all vertebrates, had cartilage, and as people who love ancient sharks know, cartilage rarely fossilizes. We've got ways of estimating the amount of cartilage present, but their exact morphology is unknown. We can't bracket it either because it's incredibly variable, even between related taxa. Using CT scans and modern animals, Taylor and Wedel found that the percentage of cartilage appears to correlate to the elongation of the cervical vertebrae. They also looked at how this cartilage would have affected the flexibility of the neck. Typically, amniotes have intervertebral discs of cartilage. However, birds usually have layers of hyaline cartilage and synovial joints. Stevens and Parrish in 2005 reject Paul's position that sauropods had discs since their cervical vertebrae are epistocelate, ball and socketed. However, some birds actually do have discs, such as ostriches, and it seems the majority of workers agree that they had discs, since a lack of discs may just be a derived condition in birds. Looking at a turkey, whose cartilage percentage was 4.56%, they found that the percentage elevated the posture of the turkey by 15%, and they also found that the added length of 11% of each cervical from cartilage increased the range of motion by 11% at each intervertebral joint. Also, they used Lego as the setup, but they used Duplo, so I don't know about that.
Way to go, turkey!
I'm a rooster!
Now, contradicting this is another study in 2013, this time by Cogley et al. They looked at the effects of cartilage in an ostrich, and they've found both that as they removed neck muscles, the neck became more flexible, and that the neck was most flexible when all of the cartilage was removed. So, what's going on here? The effect of cartilage on flexibility might be something that varies between different taxa, but what seems to be the case is that posture being raised by it is more likely. Maybe the fact that ostriches had intervertebral discs led to the disparity. Cobley's team also looked at how ONP50 holds up, and found that it actually overestimated the flexibility of the ostrich neck. They also mentioned that it doesn't seem to have a clear pattern with the other specimens studied, so it's not exactly reliable. Can biomechanical models of the necks aid us? The idea is that the bending moments along the neck can be calculated using a bunch of physics stuff that I don't want to think about, but the methodology seems to assume intervertebral discs. It only allows for rough calculations. However, it's still something within the ballpark. In 2002, Christian got a range of 0 to 30 degrees for Diplodocus. Giraffatitan had a near vertical posture, and Dicraeosaurus had a similar range to Diplodocus, but the evidence was less conclusive apparently. The general idea was that both Diplodocoids were horizontally inclined, although a small elevation is still reasonable. In 2007, Zemsky and Christian looked at Giraffatitan again, and found a habitual posture of 60 to 70 degrees inclined that lowered by 20 degrees during locomotion. And in 2010, Euhelopus was modeled and found to have had a straight neck at a 40 to 50 degree angle. Euhelopus's posture is likely an underestimate though, since its highly wedged sacrum and huge scapula coracoid would have increased the height further, so these results don't really seem conclusive. Now, a major concern regarding elevated posture in sauropods is the energy and blood pressure requirements. On its own, the energy to keep the neck in position is actually quite achievable. Sauropod vertebrae were invaded by air sacs, and the bifurcation of the neural spines in some would have been filled with air sacs too, and accessory cervical ligaments. The ligament system in sauropods has been a bit of a complicated subject. Schwartz et al. In a different 2007 paper favor an avian-style system, with most of the trough being filled by diverticula, while Woodruff in 2014 and 2016 found a correlation between bifurcated neural spines and low grazing in animals with heavy loads on their heads. He thought that they'd have a mammal-like split nuchal ligament, and the trough would be completely filled by ligaments. However, less than a month ago, a paper looking at sauropod ligaments by Williams and Harris found a sort of combination of avian-style interlaminar elastic ligaments and supraspinal ligaments as seen in other modern reptiles to be likely. This comes down to what a nuchal ligament actually is. We actually have a preserved section of ligament in a Titanosaurian, which is insane, and Woodruff and co-authors described it as a nuchal ligament. However, Harris in 2024 goes into great detail on why this seems to be a mischaracterization. Nuchal ligaments are mostly seen in ungulates and aren't common outside of that clade in mammals. A lot of ligaments in other taxa, extinct or otherwise, are called nuchal ligaments, but are actually just supraspinal ligaments, which aren't the same thing. So this would go against a nuchal ligament supporting horizontal feeding. Woodruff's reasoning was that these bifurcated nuchal ligaments are an adaptation for heavy mobile weights being held adjacent to the pectoral girdle. He compares Diplodocus to an Ankoli Watusi cattle, whose horns weigh a whopping 90 kilograms, and it's basically if Megalosaurus decided to be a cow. However, according to Harris, his figures show morphology more akin to reptilian supraspinal ligaments. Zemsky and Christian looked at an ostrich's neck for the function of their nuchal ligaments, and found that the maximum strain on the ligaments is horizontal, so passively raising the neck was more energy efficient than keeping it straight. They also note that Diplodocus was probably a low browser, but so were ostriches, and that while moving or at rest, the head would be above the shoulders. The main energy requirement sauropods need to get around isn't actually lifting their necks, it's pumping blood to their brains. Seymour and Lillywhite looked at a Barosaurus, which they estimate at 40 tons, and compare it to an equally sized fin whale. Those of you that know fluid dynamics will know that pressure increases with the depth of the fluid column, so an erect-necked Barosaurus will have some challenges. 100 millimeters of mercury is a general average blood pressure in mammals, but for Barosaurus it needs to be 7 times that of the whale. To do this, the left ventricle alone would need to weigh 2 tons, 5% of the entire animal's mass. This would be 15 times heavier and 5 times thicker than the left ventricle of the fin whale, but would only get the same amount of blood pumped. Not to mention that a giant thick-walled heart would take more energy to deform it than to actually pump the blood. The Barosaurus would use 62% of its metabolic energy solely to keep its resting heart rate 2.4 times the cost that the whale deals with. There have been some proposed solutions, but they each have their issues. The closest answer the authors come up with is for sauropods to have had a lower metabolic rate than mammals, which would allow for smaller stroke volumes with either a smaller, faster beating heart or a lower rate of blood flow. Luckily for us, we know that sauropods were a decent bit lower, metabolically speaking, when compared to mammals. From histology, we know that they had fast, continuous growth thanks to the presence of haversian bone and fibromalleolar bone, which are common in mammals, but the presence of lines of arrested growth means that at least part of their growth is cyclical, which is seen in modern ectotherms. On top of that, a study modeling Plateosaurus and Coelophysis found that they had a metabolism similar to an ostrich or a monotreme, which is definitely lower than modern eutherians, but higher than saurians. High-browsing may have offset this metabolic strain somewhat if food is spread out. In that same paper that modeled Euhalopus's posture, it was found that the energy required for a Giraffe Titan to hold its head high up for 5 minutes was lower than that needed to walk 20 meters or more. So if food is spread out, or maybe even scarce, which we know it was in places like the Morrison Formation with their continuous droughts, energetically speaking, it'd be more cost-effective to reach higher foliage, and this principle can be applied to Diplodocus as well. Better to get some food than none at all. The blood pressure argument has also been used to question the sauropod's ability to rear, but that seems to be a point in favor of tall necks to me. We know that pretty much all sauropods could rear for at least a little bit of time, and contrary to some previous ideas, proportion and balance isn't the biggest factor, it's the animal's mass. These values are also likely overestimates since no cartilage between the bones or soft tissue foot pads were considered. The pads on the hands would have been necessary for larger sauropods in order not to break their hands on the way down. It's also worth noting that the pads on the feet would have essentially made the hind limbs plantigrade and further put the front of the animal upward. But the reason I bring this up is that sauropods would have had to rear anyways in order to mate. There have been some wacky ideas trying to get out of this, but that's something I really don't want to get into. Even if they used water for buoyant forces like some have suggested to help support them, the head would still be meters above the heart, and presumably be raised anyways in order to breathe. We're nearing the end of this long video, but we have to look at feeding mechanisms. The diets of sauropods have often been used to argue for their neutral positions. This is misleading, however, since animals that feed in certain ways tend not to take their feeding stance when at rest or in locomotion. Who knows at this point? Finally, let's look at some reasoning that isn't really testable. It's been argued that a higher neck posture has 3 clear benefits: increasing the feeding envelope, a greater ability to survey the environment, and keeping the vulnerable neck out of reach of predators. These are all ideas that make sense intuitively, but Stevens cautions against this. He writes, "These often repeated and seldom challenged speculations amount to little more than scientific mythology." And while he's kinda right that something making sense doesn't mean it's true, I mean, we thought aquatic dinosaurs made sense for a long time, I just feel like these reasons are quite clear and have evidence in modern animals. Also, this AMNH specimen of Camarasaurus being an articulation like this, the 11th and 12th cervicals are actually co-fused, meaning that the dorsiflexion would have been inherent to the neck in life. So at least some sauropods held their necks vertically. So this is my final interpretation of Diplodocus. The body behind the neck is raising the animal's front half with a leveling out from the forward curved dorsals. The neck is kept elevated at a relatively small angle, allowing for easier carriage with its ligament system, while following a neck that, while not flexible per se, can be raised through only small flexions in the individual vertebrae. The slope of the neck isn't very steep, in line with intervertebral stresses, while also allowing for easier blood flow. So that was a journey and a half. The script took forever to write because wording all of this in a cohesive manner that didn't feel like me spewing a bunch of facts at you guys was hard. But hopefully we've come to a semi-close conclusion to this saga. And now I'm going to break that satisfaction because not only are the girdles up to interpretation, but the cervical vertebrae in pretty much all sauropods are distorted and damaged. This video took a lot of time to research, and it's actually why the redesigning video has been put off for so long, so I would really appreciate it if you guys did all the YouTube things. Let me know what your opinions are on sauropod posture. If I missed anything or mischaracterized something, I would love to know if I made a mistake. And also, tell me your favorite sauropod. That'll be it from me, and I will see you guys in my next video whenever that may be. Hopefully pretty soon.